All right, let's look at some specific event handlers. So before we dive in, and we've got a bunch of code and examples we're going to look at here. A quick recap. So event handlers, there's multiple ways for you to build, for you to implement an event handler. So the one we've looked at so far is a separate class that implements the event handler interface. And that was the example, this example here that we've been looking at. We're going to look at some other ways to do that. And we're going to use something called inner classes. So in this video, we're going to look at a named inner class that and the same thing, it implements the event handler interface. We're also going to look at an anonymous inner class. That's a class that doesn't have a direct reference. You don't name this class. You just go ahead and start creating it. If you've never done this, this looks a little odd at first, but you get used to it pretty quickly. Now, before we start, remember these different mechanisms that we're going to look at, they all do the same thing. These are different ways to do it that may or may not, depending on the situation, may be more convenient, for you, the developer. A quick word on inner classes. So an inner class is a class inside of a class. The class that it resides in is sometimes referred to as the outer class or the enclosing class. Why do this? In some situations, especially with GUI programming, with JFX GUI programming, it makes our code, it makes things a little bit easier. Here is an example of an inner class, and this is the example from the slide here. So let's take a look here. Public class show inner class. So this is the outer class. This is the outer or the enclosing class. Notice it has one private member of simple type int called data, and it's got a method called do something that does wonderful things. Now, in this example, which is not a JFX kind of thing, this is a command line based example, we're going to go ahead and we're going to create an instance of this inner class. And here is the inner class. Notice where it falls. This class is declared, see this keyword class, this is within. And here, this curly brace is the start. This curly brace right here is the start of the class. This curly brace right here is the end of the class. So the whole thing exists within the enclosing class, which is named show inner class. Notice here it's got one method, and here's sort of the key here. This is why we use these things. This inner class has access to the data, even the private data and the methods of the outer or enclosing class. So notice here, it's got access to this member, even though it's private. Now, is this always the right thing to do? No, not always, but you'll see in an example coming up that in many cases it is the right thing to do, and it can make the whole process a lot easier. So let's look at some code. I'll minimize PowerPoint here. Okay, so let's look at some code, and here is a really simple event, a class called simple event, and it's even simpler than the one we've been looking at. So all it does is we click this button, OK button click. That's all this does. Let's see the mechanism here. So here's our handler class. OK handler class, handler1 equals new OK handler class. All right, fair enough. Now we associate this handler with the button. Here's our button OK. So this is step 2. And this is this set method, set on action, and set on action takes as an argument an instance of a class that implements the event handler interface. So this is our situation, and this is the one we have been looking at, where even though it's in the same file, this is a so here's the end. Here's simple event. Here's the end of simple event. Here, this class is a completely standalone class. Remember, in Java, you can have one public class per file. See, this is not a public class. So you can have one public class per file. This thing lives in simpleEvent.java, but you can have additional classes in here. All right, let's look at another example. All right, here is an example with an inner class. Now, truth be told, this is not hugely different, but let's look and see what we have going on. Public class, simple event inner class extends application, the usual thing. But notice here, simple event inner class, and here is the start. Here is the end. Now, as before, I've got a button control. I've got a handler class, and I'm going to associate this button control with this handler class. Now, in this case, the handler class is an inner class. When this runs, if we run this, simple event inner class, what's going on? Okay, so when we click the button, the handle method of our handler class is invoked. Now, the question here in this example, have we really gained anything by doing this? Maybe, maybe not. You could argue, you could debate, is this a little cleaner to have the inner class here for the handler? Maybe. Maybe some people would say that it is. But this in and of itself is not the reason for having inner class. Let's look at this next example. Here is the real reason for having inner classes. So here we've got simple event inner class label, and here is the end of simple event inner class label. So let's go ahead and run this. Let's go ahead and run this. So this time what happens? This time, notice, in addition to our button, we've got a label here, just a regular label. And note also, and this is important, the label is a private member of what we've called simple event inner class label. So the label is a private member, and I've called it label count. And also note we've got this counter that is also a private member of this class. When we click this, the OK button is clicked, and as you can see, every time we click it, the count goes up. So we're keeping track of how many times we've clicked the button. Let's look at what's going on. So as before, we have a button control. OK handler class, handler 1 equals new OK handler class. OK, so here's the handler. Here we do the association. In this case, when the event is fired, we're here and we're going to invoke and execute the handle method of our handler class. And notice here, the handle method has direct access to my private data members here. Here I'm going to increment count, and I'm going to do label count.set text. The count is plus count, and I'm going to append that. I'm going to set the text, and you can see I'm off to the races. Now note, think about this for a second. Suppose it was another class. Suppose it was my standalone class that wanted to access these private data methods. Could it be done? Sure, it could, but you would need getters and setters. You can't directly access the private members of a class from another class. So I would be obliged to provide mechanisms to access these members. And depending on the application, maybe that's the case. But if I don't want to do it solely for the purposes of event handling. And in this case, this is a really, really nice usage. This is a perfect usage of an inner class. This is the perfect usage of an inner class to access the private members of the enclosing class. So a perfect example. And notice also, this is a named inner class. The name of this inner class is OK Handler class. Let's look at one more example. So, and this also does the same thing. This is just another way to do it. And some would say this is even more convenient. It's nice, it's compact. It does take a little getting used to. So here is an event-driven example with an anonymous inner class. So notice here, public simple class, simple anonymous label. It starts here, it ends, this is the end of class. Now notice, I don't see an inner class. I don't see an explicit inner class here. So let's see what's going on. Here I have my button. Here I have my label. So same as before. Note what's going on in the set on action. Remember, the set on action method takes as a parameter an instance of a class that implements the event handler interface. Set on action takes a single parameter, and that parameter is an instance of a class that implements the event handler interface. So notice what we're doing here. Here is set on action, and notice here, right inside where we normally put the arguments, we're going to go ahead and we're going to implement a small class right here. Here is the opening parenthesis. Here, you can see highlighted there is the closing parenthesis for this set on action method. Notice, new event handler action event. So here we have a class that implements the event handler interface. Notice here, because we're creating, so this is like a constructor here, just like what you're normally used to. It's a constructor. It's not in the place we're used to seeing it. So we're creating the class, and here's the opening curly brace, and here's the closing curly brace for this anonymous inner class. So we're doing steps 1 and 2 right here. We're creating a handler, and we're associating the handler with a particular control. Now, event handler action event implements, so it implements the event handler interface. The event handler interface has one method, handle, and here's the method right in here. So here's the beginning of my method. Here's the end of my method. Note that the code, the actual code, is exactly the same. You know, exactly the same. We print our little message, we increment the count, and we set the text of the label just to prove it to ourselves. Simple event anonymous label, and there it is. It does. So it does exactly the same thing. This idea of an anonymous inner class where the class is created right here on the fly and it's actually the argument to a method, this is a pretty popular technique. This is a pretty popular and widely used technique. And you will see it. You will see it. You will see it in other references and other programming languages. This has become a pretty common thing to do. So just to kind of recap very briefly, we can have a separate class that implements the event handler interface. That's the one we started out looking at. We can have a named inner class that implements the event handler interface. We can have an anonymous inner class. It also implements the event handler interface. The one we haven't looked at in this video is the lambda expression. We'll look at that another time. But here, these are three methods we've looked at. And notice they all, just so you're clear, they all do the same thing. There's sort of the art of it is knowing when to select which one. Okay, so that's it for now.